focus first on this oil objective, because even though Secretary Rubio has outlined this 3-phase plan, we haven't heard President Trump mention anything about a democratic transition. So in my view, because it's been made very clear that President Trump is the one calling the shots, until we hear President Trump articulate some policy or some support for a transition, my sense is that that is not going to be a actual part of the plan. So on the oil side, you have Venezuela producing about 900,000 barrels of oil per day. Big picture for the global supply, that's less than 1% of global supply. So in sort of the global scale, it's quite a small amount. But of course, Venezuela's economy is almost completely dependent on oil revenues. So that impacts Venezuela a lot. I agree with some of what Mariana was saying, which is in order to achieve President Trump's objective of rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector, you need a few things. For one, you need new laws, a new economic framework, essentially institutional changes, structural changes that can really only be done by a democratically elected government. And then two, you need the investment. Those, the rule of law, those structural institutional changes are going to give investors confidence that their investment will be secure. And we have President Trump saying just yesterday or 2 days ago that the type of investment he has in mind is $100 billion, which indicates, this multi-year effort. That doesn't square up or doesn't match up with the big picture, the big global oil picture, which is the market is very well supplied right now. You have non-OPEC oil production that's going to be coming from the Americas, which the International Energy Agency refers to as the Americas Quintet. That's the United States, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, and Guyana. These countries are going to be adding supply to the market. And I think in the coming years, what you're going to see is an oversupply of oil. So the world, just in practical terms, does not need more, and certainly the United States does not need more Venezuelan oil, which is a very specific type of oil. It's heavy, it's sour, it requires significant inputs in order to get it into a state that it can be moved. And then it requires refining. And to refine Venezuelan oil, you need a very specific type of refinery. So there are only a few, there are specific refineries around the world that can even accept Venezuelan oil to refine it and turn it into a product that can be used. So, that's another aspect why it's a larger objective of rebuilding Venezuela's energy sector over this multi-year, really a decade-long commitment that would be needed, doesn't match up with sort of the reality. And then I want to turn really quickly to the sanctions aspect of this. So Venezuela is under a very complicated sanctions program. And I can take questions on specifics later on, but sort of big picture is you have the entire government of Venezuela that has been blocked as part of the US sanctions program. You also have the Venezuelan energy sector, the oil sector, that is under sanctions, and you have Venezuela's financial sector under sanctions. So what I would expect to see, if the objective was to meaningfully and substantially rebuild the oil sector, invite investors in, and maybe this is something that is coming but has not been articulated yet, is a clear signal to the market, especially to the investors and the oil companies that the administration is trying to attract, that sanctions are not going to get in their way. And there are different ways to do that. There's different ways to slice it, but it could be through some sort of lifting of sanctions or suspension of sanctions, or some general authorizations, basically blanket carve-outs for U.S. persons to be able to not have to abide by the restrictions. And what the market would be looking for would be some sign of a long-term sanctions waiver commitment. Not something short-term, because again, these are really large investments, really long-term investments. So far, we haven't seen any of that. So far, what we have is the Secretary of Energy indicating a few really important things. One, that the US government is going to indefinitely be selling Venezuelan oil. Another thing that the Department of Energy has announced is that there are going to be authorizations for selling the oil and for dealing with the proceeds, and I'll get into that in a second. But no details. Are these the U.S. government, through the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, does have a mechanism through which they can issue private authorizations. So these are authorizations for a single company to do a certain transaction or a certain deal or a certain set of transactions. That might be the route that they're going. It's not clear. And so I think that'll be an important piece of this puzzle to see where things are going. And then two really quick things. I want to just mention the blockade. So President Trump has made clear that the blockade, which is being enforced by the naval deployment off the coast of Venezuela, will remain in place. The blockade is meant to enforce the oil sector sanctions and really target these the shadow fleet, which is essentially a set of hundreds of vessels that transport not just Venezuelan, but they transport Venezuelan oil, Iranian oil, and Russian oil around the world on the black market. And they sell the oil at a discount because the buyers are taking a big risk by dealing with sanctioned oil. So you have the black market, this shadow fleet selling Venezuelan oil and oil from other sanctioned countries. And the Trump administration, for the first time that I'm aware of, is using the military to enforce U.S. sanctions and target the shadow fleet. That raises a whole other set of questions, but related to just the specific blockade, I think we need to see what's going to happen to the blockade, whether the military force will stay there just to enforce the blockade and also add pressure onto the regime, what that means for, is 100% of the oil going to start going to the U.S.? That's certainly what it sounds like. And what does that mean for sort of Venezuela's commitments with some of its other partners in the oil sector? And then finally, I want to mention the questions that I have, or the concerns that I have related to although we have very little information about how the Trump administration plans to use the proceeds of oil and what they plan to do. But what they've said so far, which is very little, is that it is not going to go to the Treasury Department. It is not going to be part of the funds that have oversight and controls that would normally be part of government funds. So far, what's been indicated is that the proceeds of the oil, Venezuelan oil that the U.S. government sells, is going to settle in a U.S. account, unclear where. And there's also been reporting that the money it's unclear where in sort of the transaction will be in offshore accounts, which of course raises a lot of questions about that. And then the final thing is where the money goes, who uses it, what kind of controls are there going to be to make sure that the money doesn't end up sort of being used for corrupt purposes. And one of the two main issues. One, some of the funds I think inevitably will need to go to Delcy Rodriguez in order for her to run the government that she's overseeing now, to the extent that it meets this overarching U.S. objective of oil. So that has sanctions implications, but of course raises other questions. And then this objective, or this what President Trump has said, that the money will benefit the Venezuelan people, sort of going back to what some of the other panelists said. Right now, the Venezuelan people are not being represented at this proverbial table. You have the U.S. government, you have Delcy Rodriguez's government. Who is representing the Venezuelan people to determine how best to use those proceeds to their benefit? So that's an open question in my mind, and I think a big concern. If there is no representative, there's no mechanism for a representative of the Venezuelan people to inform how those funds are used. And I'll stop there.